Happy Yom Ha'atzmaut to everyone as we celebrate Israel's 76th birthday, and in the history of Judaism, there haven't since the times of the Chashmonaim, we haven't had as much of an opportunity to celebrate like this. This type of Jewish independence, and the idea of is Judaism in Israel better? These days with everything going on, there have been those who have said that when they're in Israel, they feel safer than when they're in America. That can depend on where you find yourself geographically and the like. But in celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut, we're going to take a look at some sources that have a sense of that connect Jewish life with living in Israel as optimal or not. So just to kick things off, since it's Israel's Independence Day, they always have a collection of facts and figures as to where we are as Israel turns 76. Source number one: Israel's population ticks towards 10 million milestone as it marks 76 years. This was in the Times of Israel a couple of days ago. Israel's population has risen to approximately 9.9 million and is expected to surpass the 10 million mark by the time the country celebrates its 77th birthday next year. The Central Bureau of Statistics said Thursday, country's population grew by about 189,000 people, the agency said in an annual estimate released ahead of Israel's 76th Independence Day, which will begin Monday night. Overall, the country added 196,000 babies, 37,000 immigrants, while 60,000 people died since Israel marked 75 years of independence. While those figures add up to 173,000, the Bureau note also included those added to the population roll due to family unification and those taken off the roll for being abroad for more than a year. See, I didn't know that. Sometimes the population's growth is not based on birth and loss, not on death, but on changes in the family. According to CBS, there were 7,247,000 Jewish Israelis living in Israel, making up 73.2% of the population, down 0.03% from a year ago, while another 2,089,000 or 21.1% are Arab, up 0.01, and 564,000 or 5.7 coming from other minority groups, up 0.02, down 0.03, up by 0.01 plus 0.02. Everything equals out. According to estimates published in 2018, the population is expected to reach 11.1 million by 2030, 13.2 million by 2040. In Israel's centenary year, 2048, the population is predicted to hit 15.2 million. We should all live and be well. According to the same study, which assumes a business-as-usual growth curve, Israel's population will hit 20 million in 2065. With 9.7 million non-Haredi Jews and assorted non-Arab minorities, 6.4 million ultra-Orthodox Jews, and 3.8 million Arabs. Okay, we're in for a population growth. Okay, we'll have to see. It's already been noted even the last couple of years that some of the business-as-usual numbers aren't necessarily working out. But in any event, right, how many Jews were there in 1948? What was the population of Israel? Anyone remember? It's about 600,000. So that's where things were then, and now we're at nearly 10 million. So there's what to celebrate, and the idea in terms of where the Jewish population lives, relates to some of the laws of the land. There's an idea that some of the agricultural laws, the mitzvot tluyot ba'aretz, laws relating to the land, are only fully applicable when you have a majority of the Jews in the land. This is something that the Rambam talks about. We're not there yet. We don't yet have 50% of the world Jewish population in Israel, but we're close. And it's always been something that this approach of the Rambam has always kind of been fanciful, because when would you ever have that many Jews in Israel? And now all of a sudden, as we get within a couple of points of this being accurate, that Rambam becomes more relevant, and how that plays out in the world of agricultural Jewish law and the like will obviously be a different class, but it's something that people never even dreamed of, and all of a sudden, here we are. And of course, it all depends. They ask for who is a Jew, what's the definition. One thing you have with regards to Israel is you have, they're able to keep track of who's who, even those who aren't halakhically Jewish. So that is even, part of the that gets factored into the account based on the record keeping they have in Israel. So lots of Jews, plenty to be thankful for this Yom HaAtzmaut. And what about living in Israel? Right, the idea of the living in Israel, is it a mitzvah or not, has often been a discussion that some, like the Ramban Nachmanides, say absolutely, and some point out the fact that the Rambam Maimonides doesn't count it as one of the 613 commandments, and then others say, well, it doesn't have to be counted as a commandment because it's obvious, right? Almost like we hold these truths to be self-evident. You have to be in Israel to be a Jew. So some of that discussion comes from the end of Masechet Ketubot. The end of Masechet Ketubot deals with some of the laws relating to the land, the intersection between family law and living in the land. And if one spouse wants to go to Israel, the other spouse doesn't want to go to Israel. It's within a discussion of a whole series of life choices that one spouse makes and the other one disagrees with. They talk about, for example, moving from the city to the suburbs. Each spouse has a veto, or they talk about from a better neighborhood to a worse neighborhood, or a worse neighborhood to a better neighborhood, and how all this stuff gets defined. That's discussed. And one of those discussions is, let's say the husband wants to move to Israel and the wife doesn't, or let's say they live in Israel and the wife wants to move to Jerusalem and the husband doesn't. So this is what's discussed there towards the end of Masechet Ketubot. And there you find the expression, the Soji is taught. Source number 2, a person should always reside in Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that is mostly populated by Gentiles. You should not reside outside of Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that is mostly populated by Jews. The reason is that anyone who resides in Eretz Yisrael is considered as one who has a God. And anyone who resides outside of Eretz Yisrael is considered as one who does not have a God. As it is stated, to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. Right? And getting the land, and in the land, Hashem is called your God. So if you're outside the land, Hashem is not your God. So this is clearly an agadata. It's a narrative teaching of the Talmud. It doesn't have halachic relevance in terms of those of us who are not in Israel right now. I think that's all of us. We do have God, and we're not considered heretics. But there's a very strong association between living in Israel and that being the fullest Jewish experience. Very famously, in this section, in the commentary on this section of the Talmud, there's the famous comment of Rabbeinu Chaim, who said nowadays there's no mitzvah anymore because it's dangerous. And he's writing in the 11th, 12th century, and we can understand that being dangerous at that time because the world was a very different place then, and it probably was dangerous. It was probably dangerous to walk outside the city limits, let alone to walk outside one's country and to go to the land of Israel. So many people always turn to, when talking about whether there's an obligation to live in the land of Israel, and not say, yeah, there's an obligation, but look, Rabbeinu Chaim already told us it's dangerous. We're not going to. We don't have to go. In a sense, he's saying we're exempt because we don't have to go. So some would say, full stop. Rabbeinu Chaim has now let us all off the hook. Others say, yeah, that was then. It's not dangerous anymore. Some would say, look, there's often wars there. It is dangerous, and that has become a point of discussion and contention with regards to the mitzvah to live in Israel. One of the ways to thread the needle with regards to whether there's a mitzvah to live in Israel or not has to do with whether it's an obligation, whether there's an active obligation to live in Israel, or you fulfill the mitzvah when you go to Israel. Right, so some would try to understand the complexity and the ambiguity around the sources. Nachmanides says it's a mitzvah. Maimonides says it's not a mitzvah. Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen lets you off the hook. Others say you're not off the hook. You're not obligated to go to Israel, but every time you go to Israel, you spend time in Israel, that's considered a mitzvah. And going to Israel or living in Israel is considered a mitzvah fulfillment, even though it's not an obligation. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein pointed out that some people will say, "Oh, I'm not obligated to go. I don't have to go." Rabbi Moshe Feinstein points out that men are not obligated to wear tzitzit, right? Tzitzis. We don't have to wear the fringes. That's also not an obligatory, a chiyuvi obligation. It's not an active obligation. When does one have to wear tzitzit? Only if one's wearing a four-cornered garment, right? Any of the men on this here wearing a four-cornered garment? Normally, no. So you don't have to wear tzitzit ever. And Rabbi Feinstein points out that's not what the rabbis intended. The rabbis were commenting that you have to wear tzitzit in a four-cornered garment. If you don't have one, you should put one on so that you're obligated regardless. So Rabbi Feinstein says we were very careful to do our best to proactively perform mitzvahs in which there's no proactive obligation. We shouldn't hide behind that when it comes to not living in Israel. We have to find other justifications. And the Talmud talks about leaving Israel to get married, to get a job, to get an education. And again, that's not really the subject of our discussion, but it all emerges from the unique nature of Israel in the Jews' spiritual accomplishment and fulfillment. And so what we're going to look at now is we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into this idea of Israel as this special place for God. Israel as only in Israel is it as if we fully have our relationship with Hashem. And there are a couple of verses and Talmudic interpretations of those verses. And we'll look at those. And first, any questions, comments, reactions?
Rabbi,
yes.
I believe there is a priority of moral obligations. And therefore, I believe a person should be close to family overrides any other obligation. And I've been to Israel many times, and if there was no other considerations, I would live in Israel, very honestly. But there is a priority, and my entire family lives here in the United States. Right. What do you think about that?
So I think that maintaining or developing that type of priority of obligation has factored into the halachic decision-making process of, right? We if you look at the way Jews observe rituals, we're very careful on Shabbos and kosher and other ritual matters, but we don't put the same priority on living in Israel. And often because there are certain outside considerations that get made. And part of that comes from the fact that it probably was complicated. Look at all the rabbis who were telling us whether there's a mitzvah to live in Israel or not. These are generally rabbis who didn't live in Israel and are having the conversation. We've been a diasporic community, which has allowed that type of thinking to creep into our religious worldview. Is it a good thing? Probably it's not an ideal thing. But it was certainly worked through most of the last 2,000 years when there was little opportunity, right? You had certain, activists, certain individual stories of rabbis that stand out that went to Israel, whether it be even Maimonides. Maimonides has a tomb in Tveria. Nachmanides, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, right? There are stories of those who went or tried to go, at different times. Part of it was, a reaction to the times. There have always been Jews who were longing to go to Israel who went to Israel, but it was exception, not the rule, and didn't develop very much into a movement. So, for example, you start to see, interestingly enough, in the times of the 19th century, in the students of the Vilna Gaon, students of in the Hasidic community, certain students of Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, and other early Hasidic rabbis. Maybe it's the emphasis on Jewish mysticism. Maybe it's just the situation in the world, right? We're in the post Khmelnytsky massacre era or post Shabtai Tzvi era. There's been a lot of Jewish disappointment. When there's Jewish disappointment, hey, Israel's looking mighty fine from where we are. So it seems to start to crystallize and to coalesce around then of more of a religious ideology of moving into Israel. In particular, you go to the 1700s and the Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer and the Chovevei Zion, right, the Lovers of Zion movement. Right, this is before Herzl, before Zionism. 50, 60 years before, you begin to see it emerge as a more viable religious, spiritual ideology and way of life, which led to some movement. You also, had, also certain, Zionistic leaning pioneers outside of the religious thinkers. You had the support of Moses Montefiore. You begin to see some pivoting towards of the attention from a non-religious perspective there. Right, just yesterday we celebrated Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, which, the 20,000 plus soldiers killed in action, and those killed from terrorist attacks and murdered. Right, what year did that start? From what year did they start keeping track? And remember, anyone listen?
1860.
Very good. That's right. We were at the same event. We heard it.
25,000. Over
So
25,000.
so we have so 1860. That's when we start recording, the modern day settlement of modern day settlement of the land of Israel, in a formal sense. So that's 40 years ahead of Herzl. Clearly, things picked up the pace with Herzl, and that added a new energy and a new momentum to the movement. But it has. We've always wanted to be there. It's been difficult to be there, but it's really only in the last 150 years or so where it's become something more of a should we or shouldn't we type of a question, because it was completely out of the realm of possibility before that. And so, once there becomes more of a we should, then we develop the hierarchy of needs of why or reasons why we shouldn't. And I think everyone has that. But this idea of a fulfilling Judaism or relationship with God as more ideal, we have some very explicit verses which require just to review and to understand and to see how they were viewed and fit into this idea. So source number 3, Devarim 11:12. Eretz asher Hashem Elokecha doreshosa tamid einei Hashem Elokecha ba mereshis hashana v'ad acharis hashana. The land that your Hashem your God looks after, in which Hashem your God always keeps an eye from year's beginning to year's end. Right? Doesn't God pay attention to the whole world? But here it highlights and specifies God paying attention to the land of Israel. And the rabbis understand this. Source 4, Tanit. The sages taught Eretz Israel was created first, and the rest of the entire world was created afterward. As it said, as yet he had not made the land nor the fields. Furthermore, Eretz Israel is watered by the Holy One, blessed be he himself, and the rest of the entire world is watered through an intermediary, as it is stated, who gives rain upon the land and sends water upon the fields. The idea that there's a certain priority or a certain primacy that the land of Israel has in its relationship in a spiritual connection. God pays more attention. And I think if you're looking for a kind of a modern application of this, I just think you think about the way that Israel in general, but specifically the Jerusalem and the Kotel have on visitors, right? Not everyone is moved or motivated the same way religiously, but somehow the Kotel is kind of a spiritual magnet. And so, you can understand this, religiously, spiritually, Kabbalistically, or you can understand this in a way of how people express themselves practically religiously, that there's this connection that is present, that can be felt, and often is felt, based on this idea that God's paying more attention from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. There's also this heightened level of responsibility, and we've been reading about it in the recent Torah portions. Acharei Mot and Kedoshim have both included significant explicit verses about the responsibility to behave properly in the land, and not to violate the Torah's commandments, not to emulate the ways of the non-Jews, not to maintain the appropriate sexual morality. Right? We saw that in both of these last 2 weeks portions. We also see it expressed and reminded of how this has been a complicated obligation for Jews throughout history. Certainly in the times of the prophets, they were always chiding the Jewish nation for falling short of this. Right, we had this past week Parshat Kedoshim, the unique opportunity which we haven't had since 1997 of reading the Haftorah of the portion of Kedoshim, which talks about the Jerusalem's shortcomings very explicitly and very harshly. So here is a selection of those verses that was actually from towards the end of Acharei Mot. Source number 5, do not defile yourselves in any of those ways, for it is by such that the nations that I am casting before you defile themselves. Thus the land became defiled, and I called it to account for its iniquity. And the land spewed out its inhabitants. But you must keep my laws and my rules, and you must not do any of those abhorrent things, neither the citizens nor the stranger who resides among you. For all those abhorrent things were done by the people who were in the land before you, and the land became defiled. So let not the land spew you out for defiling it, as it spewed out the nation that came before you. All who do any of these abhorrent things, such person shall be cut off from their people. Right. There's actually one of the verses in that towards the end of Acharema talks about we should not emulate the Egyptians nor the Canaanites. And one of the commentaries on this, point out that there's a kind of a double-edged reminder. We shouldn't be like the Egyptians. We shouldn't be like those Jews who became comfortable in Egypt because they became too comfortable in the diaspora. Nor should we be like the Canaanites and not appreciate the special nature of the land of Israel. The Torah is introducing more of a responsibility in our land to practice the mitzvot. But that opens up a little bit of a question. Why should it matter what land you're in? Right? Isn't our mitzvot across the board, right? Some of them are land-based, but isn't our responsibility for keeping Torah the same everywhere? The short answer is yes, but these verses which talk about a specific responsibility and a specific consequence that the land requires a higher level of commitment opens up some unique approaches and voices with this idea of a unique spiritual level that exists for those who dwell in the land. And in particular, Ramban Nachmanides picks up upon this. All this idea of that you will lose the land, that you will be kicked out of the land. We actually say it every morning. We talk about in Shema that if you follow the commandments, it will be good and the rains will come. If you ignore the commandments, it will be bad and you will flare God's anger and he will stop the rain and you will you'll be lost from the land. So Ramban picks up with this and runs with it. Source number 6 is on the basis of this matter that the rabbis have said in the Sifrei, and you perish quickly from the good land. Right, and that's that verse from Shema. Although I banish you from the land to outside the land, make yourselves distinct. The rabbi said about that verse, even though I banish you from the land to outside the land, make yourselves distinctive by the commandments, so that when you return, they shall not be novelties to you. The rabbi, it's as if God is saying, look, you lost your shot, you're getting kicked out, you didn't keep the commandments. Maybe you think that Judaism only applies in Israel. No, you have to keep the commandments. Why? You have to make sure you still know how to practice them. You don't want to lose your familiarity with them. It's kind of, you got to keep practicing the mitzvahs so that when you come back, you'll be able to do a better job. This can be compared to a master who was angry with his wife. He sent her back to her father's house and told her, adorn yourself with precious things, so when you come back, they will not be novelties to you. And so did the prophet Jeremiah say to the people in exile in Babylon, set thee up waymarks. You have to have signs. These are the commandments by which Israel is made distinctive. Now the verses which state, and ye perish quickly, and ye shall lay up these words, only make obligatory in the exile the observance of those commandments affecting personal conduct, such as wearing tefillin and placing mezuzot on the doors. And concerning them, the rabbis explain that we must observe them, say, we shall not be novelty to us when we return to the land. For the main fulfillment of the commandments is to be kept when dwelling in the land of God. The idea of maintaining these commandments, really, what the rabbis make a comment that the Ramban picks up upon, that what did Hashem have in mind when he says you're going to keep some of the commandments for quote-unquote practice outside of the land of Israel? The identifying markers of the Jew, the tefillin, which are an over sign, the mezuzah, which is a sign for a Jewish hound. You got to maintain your identity. Those are the main ones. The other mitzvah that you're keeping outside of Israel, that's in a sense for practice. For the main fulfillment of the commandments is to be kept when dwelling in the land of God. Right? This is something that very often people I guess kind of summarize the Ramban by, this is where the Ramban interprets the Midrash as saying that mitzvahs outside of Israel are just for practice. Right? He's not saying that practically speaking. So in a way he's saying practice makes perfect. The idea of maintaining the mitzvos is so that one day we'll be able to do them fully when we're back in the land of Israel. He also points out this idea that really the purpose of mitzvot outside of Israel is different. And we're going to delve into that a little more deeply in the next couple of sources. But the idea of mitzvot outside of Israel is to maintain the Jewish identity. And in particular, it's those signs which demonstrate our Jewish identity. Everything else is kind of just part of the pot of mitzvot. But as he says, the main fulfillment of the commandments is to be kept when dwelling in the land of God. Continuing the Ramban, and this was the command of our patriarch Jacob, to his household, to all that were with him at the time when they came to the land, put away the strange gods that are among you and purify yourselves. Right? They've left Lavan and now they're coming back into the land. And God, by whom alone actions are weighed, brought it about that Rachel died on the way when they started coming to the land. For on account of her own merit, she did not die outside the land. And for Jacob's merit, he could not dwell in the land with two sisters in their lifetime. So this is forbidden in the Torah. So this is the idea that Rachel dies when they get back to the land. And she really should have died completely out of the land, but they let her cross into the land and then immediately thereafter die, so that Yaakov wouldn't be violating the sin of having two sisters at the same time, being married to two sisters at the same time. Right, the idea that the patriarchs kept the commandments is what the Ramban is thinking. So this is forbidden in the Torah. Rachel was the one by whose marriage the prohibition against two sisters took effect. Right? Well, why did Leah die? Why did Rachel have to die? Because Leah and Yaakov were married, and then along came Rachel, and she's the second wife. So therefore, it would appear that Rachel became pregnant with Benjamin before they came to Shechem, and while in the land, Jacob did not touch her at all for the reason that we have mentioned. This matter that the land of Israel is the inheritance of the eternal and thus cannot tolerate sinners is found in many places in the scriptures, and you'll see it clearly after I've opened your eyes to it. The Ramban wants us to take a look at the fact that if we look clearly and deeply throughout the Torah, we'll see examples. Right? Why is there such a strong covenant that the land spits you out if you're a sinner? Because the fulfillment of mitzvot is only in the land, and when you go out, you are just preparing to come back in and do it right. And we see this with Yaakov in the death of Rachel, and we're going to see it elsewhere. So this is the spiritual concept. We talk about it. Started with the rabbis talking about if you live in Israel, you have a God. If you live outside of Israel, you don't have a God. Right? That is because your religious service is compromised outside of Israel in a very fundamental way, in a spiritual way. Ramban calls this a secret in source number 7. That's where it talks about you will perish quickly from the land that God gave you, right? And he brings back the idea of putting on the tefillin and the mezuzos, and I've already written about this matter. There's a secret here. What's the secret? So the Maharal of Prague explains the secret in source number 8. He says, "Va'ani agaleh hasod," in the bold, I will reveal the secret. And he says the concept of it clearly is not a practical matter. It's not that you don't have to keep mitzvos outside of Israel. Looking at the bold of the Maharal source 8. Right, you fulfill the mitzvos in the diaspora as well. The mitzvos would be new when you come to the land, when you come back to the land. We don't have new mitzvos. There's only one giving of the Torah, and that took place already. But they're of a lower level of obligation. We talk about, it's always my favorite question to ask people, what does the word mitzvah mean? So people usually say mitzvah means good deed. Mitzvah may be a good deed, but mitzvah literally means commandment, tzav. However, the Kabbalists understand the word mitzvah can mean savta, connection. Right? The mitzvah, our religious obligations, are opportunities of connecting to the divine. And the Maharal is explaining the Ramban based on that. It's only in Israel that you have that closest of connection developing between the actions being performed and God. It's only there. The connection is weaker outside of the land of Israel. And he concludes, chayav mechutz la'aretz. Therefore, look, the Jew can't shake any of the mitzvahs. Anything that a Jew has to do physically, you can't shake. So what does that mean when he goes into Israel? They're already familiar. They're not new. You still have to perform them. They're not new. This is very correct. In a sense, it's like a placekeeper. You can't shake the mitzvos because they're part of the obligation of the Jew. The Jew's life involves mitzvot, but that connection is weakened. That connection is less when the Jews living outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the fullness of the connection with God, thinking back to the language of the Gemara in Ketubot, that if you live in Israel, you have a God. You live outside Israel, you don't have a God. Yeah, you live outside Israel, you have less of an opportunity to connect to God through the performance of the mitzvah. And the author of the Divrei Chanina, source number 9, looks at it also from a spiritual perspective. The idea, looks at it from a neshama perspective, that mitzvot have two different parts. Mitzvot have both the physical application and the spiritual refinement. And he says the spiritual refinement is not the same when mitzvahs are performed outside of Israel. I think these are more spiritual, somewhat say mystical concepts, but I think we can see as manifest just in the difference in the natural performance of mitzvot in Israel versus outside of Israel. And one good example to demonstrate are what are the non-Orthodox or the Chiloni population in Israel. Right, the Chiloni is the term used for secular, but I think all of us, have experience or familiar that the default setting in Israel is much more Jewish than the diaspora because Israel is a Jewish state, and so you have people, the terms religious and secular don't fully apply, because I have plenty of Israelis who will say, I'm not dati, but, and this is an expression I think is very true, the only person who thinks a secular Israeli is a secular Israeli. Right? Because they think they're Chiloni because they're not dati, they're not religious, they're not Haredi, they're not ultra-Orthodox. But you line up a secular Jew in Israel with a secular Jew in America, and it's, that secular Israeli seems ultra-Orthodox by comparison. And it comes from the knowledge of Hebrew, and it comes from the familiarity with Jewish ritual. There's this, I think that, another way of expressing this secret of the Ramban and the difference of mitzvot performed in the diaspora versus Israel is this idea of a more natural. Living the rhythm of Judaism in Israel creates a neshama, a soul, a religious personality that is more Jewish than outside of Israel. And I don't think that was necessarily encountered by the Ramban or the Maharal. There was a different, Jewish environment then. Then it was either you're Jewish or you're living, you're part of the Jewish community, or you're outside the community. But when you talk about this two levels or two components of the mitzvah, the actual performance and the refinement of the soul, and the refinement of the soul only exists in Israel, I think it's the Jewish environment of Israel that creates this familiarity the innate Judaism, the innate Jewishness of the person comes from living in Israel. And I think that's type of a contemporary application of that secret and that refinement as expressed by the Maharal and the Divrei Chanina. So now just a couple of observations from some of the champions of our modern Orthodox religious Zionist community when it comes to Israel. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein is actually talking about this issue. He's talking about this Ramban and this idea that the mitzvahs are quote unquote better in Israel than the diaspora. So he says in source number 10, this is, I repeat, a bold thesis, one which, despite my enormous admiration and respect for the Ramban, I have great personal difficulty in digesting. Is it conceivable, we ask ourselves, that the avodat Hashem, the serving of God, and the kiyum mitzvot, fulfillment of mitzvot, of many Gedolei Yisrael, Kedoshim Chasidei Elyon, religious leaders holy in the highest piety and only instrumental but no intrinsic value. Right? Are they lacking the inner portion of their service? With the example, the practical explanation I gave works for the less religious. But what about our tzaddikim, our righteous? And even if we circumscribe the comment to refer to specific acts, but not to the totality of avoda, or if we suggest the Ramban only limits the rationale of diaspora halacha, but not its character, once commanded, does not this still demean the tefillin of the Rif or the Gra and diminish their significance? Were they just like kind of symbols of Judaism without being spiritual fulfilling? And yet, in a milder version of the Ramban's position, can be readily understood and fully appreciated. Without divesting diaspora halachic observance of intrinsic value, one could accept the notion that context and location affect the character and significance of an action, so that the identical ma'aseh mitzvah performance could have incremental qualitative value when performed in Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land. Thus, it has been reported of Mori V'Rabbi, my teacher and Rabbi Y. Hutner, that upon coming to Israel after having worn tefillin en route, he was wont to put them on again, commenting, those had been chutz la'aretz tefillin, now we should put on Eretz Yisrael tefillin. And this increment is at the disposal of our perspective Ola with respect to each and every mitzvah. Right, look at it as a little bit different. Right, the Ramban is revolutionary. You can't just wipe away the mitzvah performance of 2,000 years of diaspora Jewry, including those religious leaders who we revere. However, Eino Dome, you can't compare tefillin of the diaspora to tefillin of Israel, and therefore Rabbi Hutner would put them on once again. It's a certain familiarity. It's a certain spiritual. I say this idea of spiritual refinement. Rabbi Lichtenstein is commenting on is that spiritual refinement that the Divrei Chanina mentions in source number 9, from a religious perspective. And then there's the general Israel as the Jewish country. Is something that Rav Soloveitchik noted already in 1948 in a speech he gave a month after the declaration of the State of Israel. Source number 11, with regard to redemption of the Shekhinah from defilement, I am definitely optimistic. Right? Remember, 1948, and that's something I wrote about this past week, right? 1940, we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, the 5th of Iyar, 1948, because they declared a state. But the declaration of the state wasn't the end of the battle, the start of the war. Why not celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut when the War of Independence ended? And in many ways, it's a celebration of that leap of faith, or that first step of gevurah, of might, of valor, that the Jewish people have now turned a corner. Some have compared it to Hanukkah, right? The idea that the dates we celebrate Hanukkah was not the end of the war against the Greeks; it was in the middle, but it represented a victory that was on a path towards Jewish heroism growing. And the same is true with the State of Israel. So that, from that perspective, people in 1948, there was a celebratory moment, and then there was a lot of angst as to whether or not this would actually work. But with regards to the spiritual side, the Rav is saying, I'm definitely optimistic. Whoever ultimately stands at the helm, life in Israel will to a certain extent be completely Jewish. I read in the press that the kitchens of the Israeli army are strictly kosher. When on that fateful Friday, the establishment of the State of Israel was proclaimed, the ceremony was held 8 hours early so as not to desecrate the Sabbath, despite various logistical difficulties associated with doing this. The act alone sanctified the Sabbath. More than 50 rallies dedicated towards Sabbath observance. Right, and this connects to the idea that we move the dates of Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, to ensure that Shabbat is protected. And remember, in the 1940s, that was a time of great difficulty when people had to work Saturdays, and they were often within the Orthodox community, the OU and National Council of Young Israel would organize rallies, to protect the sanctity of the Sabbath and encourage Jews not to work on Saturday, employers to make that possible, even though that was not the norm. Naturally, religious Jewry must stand watch and fight for it, but I can assure you, everyone, that Shabbat in Eretz Yisrael will be holier than it was in the Jewish neighborhood in Berlin, in the Frankfurt Ghetto, or even on Bedford Avenue in Brooklyn. Right? You think it's so holy in the Jewish neighborhoods, and you can extend that to Teaneck and the 5 towns today. I also believe that in Israel, Santa Claus will not have as wide a beard, and the radio will not play Silent Night, Holy Night. As a Jew who follows Chazal, in this I can assure all zealots in the exile. In many ways, the Rav is saying Judaism in Israel is better. It's not exclusively the only place it has to be, but there's certainly more Judaism. And if we trace this idea from the Talmud's presentation of those in Israel have a God. Well, there's a sense that Hashem pays more attention to Eretz Yisrael, is infused with the traditions that we have of the story of creation, and God's providence being felt more directly, and it's kind of in a more clearer reception. And it continues to this idea that even mitzvot are different. And while it starts with this idea that if we don't follow things, we get expelled, highlights the idea that maybe mitzvot outside of Israel are placeholders or to ensure familiarity with it. Some would call it just for practice, but not just for practice. Looking at it from the Eretz Yisrael, the Israel side, Israel is where it's more normal, where it's more natural, where it creates more of an impression, right? It's always, again, the secular Israelis, when they come to America, it's very interesting because while in Israel they're secular and they're more traditional, when you're disconnected from the mothership, it's not uncommon for Israelis to really become completely, assimilated within American culture, American society, because they don't have the familiarity over the need for a shul or a community, because in Israel, everything's Jewish. That's why there's this organization, the IAC, Israel American Coalition, to try and create more of an identity for Israelis who are in America to ensure they don't lose that sense of Judaism. And it comes from the fact it's a Jewish place. It's a little different. Maybe from a practical spiritual perspective, yes, put on tefillin a second time. But certainly, as the Rav presents, it's a spiritual. The state of Israel is a return to that spiritually, religiously superior space that we can certainly appreciate, to be grateful for, and plug into, and most appropriately to redouble that connection on Yom HaAtzmaut.